The afternoon sun stretched long fingers of gold across the vast marble floor of the hotel lobby. It was the kind of light that made everything look clean and new. But for the man at the grand piano, it only illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, tiny specks of life in a world that felt to him utterly still. He was a famous pianist, a maestro whose name was on posters in concert halls across the globe. But here, in this quiet moment, he was just a tired man sitting at a very large, very black instrument. His fingers, long and elegant, moved over the ivory keys. They danced with a precision that had taken a lifetime to perfect, striking each note with a clean, clear tone. The melody that flowed out was beautiful in a technical sort of way. It was complex and structured, a small improvisation he had pieced together in his mind. But it was empty. It was like a beautifully built machine with no soul, all gears and wires, but no heart to make it truly live. He played because it was what he did. It was his habit, his default setting when left alone with a piano. He thought about the tour. City after city, hotel after hotel, each one blurring into the next. The faces of the audience, a sea of polite applause, were becoming a single, indistinct memory. He loved music once. He remembered being a boy, small enough that his feet couldn't reach the pedals, his whole body filled with a fiery excitement every time he touched the keys. Back then, the piano was a magical box of wonders, a place where he could create storms and sunshine, where he could speak a language more powerful than words. He would lose hours in his small room, his fingers stumbling over difficult passages, not with frustration, but with the joyful determination of a climber scaling a new mountain. Every note was a discovery. Now, every note was an obligation. The music he played now was a shadow of that old passion. It was a perfect echo of a feeling that was no longer there. He watched the people in the lobby as he played. A woman in a sharp business suit strode past, her voice a low, urgent murmur into a phone.
Ow.
Her eyes fixed on the revolving doors at the far end of the room. She didn't even glance his way. A pair of elderly tourists drifted by, their heads bent over a colorful map, pointing and whispering to each other in a language he didn't recognize. To them, he was just part of the hotel's decor, like the potted ferns or the abstract paintings on the wall. He was the most famous person in this room. And yet, he had never felt more invisible. He was a ghost, haunting his own life with the sound of his own soulless music. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent his whole life chasing fame, wanting the world to hear his music, and now that the world was listening, he felt he had nothing left to say. He shifted on the leather bench, a dull ache settling into his lower back. The air in the lobby was cool and conditioned, carrying the faint mixed scents of expensive perfume, floor polish, and freshly brewed coffee from the lounge across the hall. It was a smell of artificial comfort, and it did little to soothe the restless feeling inside him. He played on, the notes tumbling out, one after another, each one a tiny drop in an ocean of sound. He looked down at his hands. They moved with an independent will, a muscle memory so deeply ingrained that he didn't even have to think. They could play the most difficult sonatas in his sleep, but his mind, his heart, was a million miles away. It was wandering through the quiet streets of his childhood, remembering the feeling of sun on his face as he ran home from school, eager to get to the old upright piano in the living room. That piano had been a beast, with yellowing keys and a sticky pedal, but it had been his best friend. This grand piano, a gleaming masterpiece of wood and steel, felt like a stranger. A young couple, laughing together, walked hand in hand past the piano. Their laughter was a bright, real sound in the lobby, a stark contrast to the manufactured melody coming from the keys. For a moment, he envied them. He envied their simple, shared joy. When was the last time he had felt that kind of pure, unthinking happiness? He couldn't remember. His life had become a schedule, a series of flights, sound checks, and performances. The joy had been squeezed out, placed by the relentless pressure to be perfect. The music began to falter. Not because his fingers made a mistake, but because his heart was no longer in it. The melody became slower, more hesitant. The notes, once so clear and precise, began to sound heavy, like they were carrying a great weight. He was no longer playing for the people in the lobby or for the ghost of his former self. He was just playing because he didn't know what else to do. The silence that would follow if he stopped felt more terrifying than the empty sound of his own playing. Finally, his hands came to rest on the keys, hovering for a second before sinking into his lap. The last note he played hung in the air for a moment, a lonely, questioning sound, before being swallowed by the quiet hum of the lobby. The silence that followed was immense. It was heavier and more profound than any music he had played all day. In that silence, he could finally hear the truth. He was tired. Not just in his body, but deep down in his soul. The fire that had once driven him was now just a bed of cold, gray ash. He sat there, staring at the polished black surface of the piano. He could see a faint, distorted reflection of himself in the wood, a tired man with slumped shoulders and a hollow look in his eyes. He didn't recognize the person looking back at him. This wasn't the celebrated maestro. This wasn't the passionate young artist. This was just a man lost in the quiet, opulent lobby of another city, wondering where the music had gone. The weight of his weariness settled over him like a thick blanket, and for the first time in a long time, he did nothing at all. He just sat and listened to the silence. The silence that followed the last note was a heavy blanket. For the man at the piano, it was louder than any music he had played that afternoon. It was a space filled with everything he was trying to ignore. The weariness in his bones, the hollowness in his chest, the faint, persistent ache of a passion that had long since cooled to embers. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting in his lap, the polished wood of the piano feeling cold and unresponsive beneath his fingers. The world of the lobby, which had faded into the background while he played, now began to seep back into his awareness. He heard the soft ding of an elevator arriving, the distant clatter of dishes from a service corridor, the low, murmuring hum of 100 different conversations blending into a single, meaningless sound. He was just another piece of furniture again, a tired man in a big room. His eyes, unfocused, drifted across the lobby. He saw the patterns in the marble, the way the light caught the edge of a brass railing, the vibrant green of a potted fern. He was looking, but he wasn't seeing. His mind was a quiet, empty room. Then, something moved at the edge of his vision. A small shape, a flicker of color. He didn't pay it much mind at first. It was probably just another guest, another fleeting presence in the river of people flowing through the hotel. But the shape didn't flow. It stopped. It stayed. He slowly turned his head. Standing a little way off, near a large potted plant that was almost as tall as he was a little boy. He couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old. He was holding his mother's hand, his small fingers wrapped tightly around hers. But he wasn't looking at his mother, and he wasn't looking at the plant. His eyes, wide and dark and serious, were fixed on the grand piano. They weren't the curious, glancing eyes of a child easily distracted. They were focused with an intensity that was startling, as if the piano were the most important thing in the world. The mother, a woman with a kind face and tired eyes, was trying to gently pull him along. She leaned down and whispered something in his ear, but the boy didn't move. He just stood his ground, his gaze locked on the gleaming black and white keys. The man at the piano watched this small, silent tug-of-war with a familiar sense of resignation. He had seen it before. Children were often drawn to the piano, to its magic and its noise. He had prepared his polite, practiced smile, the one he used for fans and strangers. A mask that said, "I am gracious, but please leave me alone." The boy, however, was not so easily deterred. After a moment of his mother's gentle tugging, he did something unexpected. He let go of her hand. It was a deliberate act. His small hand slipped from hers, and he took a single, hesitant step forward, then another. He moved with a strange purpose, his small sneakers making a soft, squeaking sound on the marble floor. He walked as if he were approaching a holy place, his steps slow and careful. The mother stayed where she was, her hands clasped in front of her, a look of gentle apology already forming on her face. The man watched the boy come closer. He saw the details now. The boy's sweater was a little too big for him, with a small hole near the cuff. His jeans were worn at the knees. He was just a normal little kid. But there was nothing normal about the look on his face. It was a look of pure, unadulterated concentration. As he got closer, the man could see his own reflection in the boy's wide eyes, a distorted, tired-looking man hunched over a piano. The boy stopped right beside the bench. He was so small that the top of his head barely reached the keyboard. He had to tilt his head all the way back to look up at the man sitting there. For a long moment, he just stared. The man stared back, his polite smile frozen on his lips. He was waiting for the boy to say something silly, to point and giggle, to do what children usually do. But the boy didn't do any of that. He just looked at him, his expression serious and deep. It was a look that seemed to see past the famous pianist, past the tired man, and straight into something else. It was a look that held a question, a need, a quiet demand. Then the boy spoke. His voice was small, but it was clear and steady, cutting through the lobby's low hum like a single pure bell. "Can I play for a moment?" he asked. The words hung in the air between them. The man's practiced smile faltered. This was the part where he was supposed to say no. He was supposed to ruffle the boy's hair, say something like, "Maybe later, little guy," and turn back to his own quiet world. He wanted to. He craved the silence, the solitude. His whole body ached with a desire to be left alone. He opened his mouth to deliver the gentle refusal, but then he looked into the boy's eyes again. He saw no shyness, no fear, no expectation of being told no. He only saw that same unwavering seriousness. It was the look of someone who wasn't just asking for a favor, but was seeking permission to fulfill a need. It was a look the man hadn't seen in a very long time, not in the faces of his colleagues, not in the eyes of his adoring fans, and certainly not in his own reflection. It was the look of pure, unfiltered desire. It reminded him of something. It reminded him of a boy many years ago who used to stare at an old upright piano in a dusty living room with that exact same look. A memory. Sharp and sudden, pierced through his fog of fatigue. He remembered the feeling of desperation, of needing to touch the keys more than he needed anything else in the world. He remembered how the world would disappear when his fingers met the ivory, how all the noise and confusion of life would fade away, leaving only the music. This little boy, with his worn sweater and his serious eyes, was a mirror to his own lost self. The refusal died in his throat. He couldn't do it. He couldn't be the one to extinguish that light, not when his own had gone out. He felt a strange, unfamiliar pull, a flicker of something that felt suspiciously like purpose. With a sigh that seemed to come from the very bottom of his soul, he gave a small, almost imperceptible wave of his hand. It wasn't a grand gesture of welcome. It was a tired, dismissive flick of the wrist, a signal that said, "Fine, go ahead. Just get it over with." He was still expecting a clumsy, noisy performance. He was expecting to have his peace shattered by a child's random banging on the keys. He was already bracing himself for it. The boy seemed to understand. He gave a single, solemn nod, as if they had just made a very important agreement. He turned his attention to the piano, his mission clear. He struggled for a moment, trying to climb onto the tall leather bench. His little legs flailed for a second before he managed to hoist himself up, his feet dangling high above the floor. He shuffled forward, wriggling his body until he was in the right position. He looked so small and insignificant sitting there, a tiny figure in front of the massive, imposing instrument. The man leaned back, crossing his arms, and settled in for what he was sure would be a very short and very loud interruption. The boy sat perched on the edge of the vast leather bench, his small body looking even smaller against the glossy black expanse of the grand piano. His feet dangled far above the floor, swinging gently, not with nervousness, but with a steady, rhythmic motion. The man watched him, his arms still crossed over his chest, a barrier of indifference he had built over years of polite but unwanted interruptions. He was ready for it. He was ready for the random, chaotic crashing of tiny hands on 88 keys. A noise that would shatter the quiet and confirm his decision to interact with the world was a mistake. He braced himself, his jaw tight, but the boy didn't immediately start playing. He did something that surprised the man. He just sat there, his hands resting in his own small lap. He looked at the keys, not as a toy to be banged on, but as a landscape to be explored. His eyes traced the line of white keys from one end to the other, then dipped down to the black ones, his head tilting slightly as if he were listening to a secret they were telling him. He seemed to be taking a moment of respect, a silent communion with the instrument before daring to make a sound. The man felt a flicker of something, a tiny crack in his wall of cynicism. This was not the behavior of a typical child. After what felt like a long time, the boy took a deep breath. It was a small, almost unnoticeable action, but the man saw it. It was the breath a singer takes before a difficult note, the breath a diver takes before plunging into the deep. Then the boy lifted his hands. They were small, pudgy hands with short fingers, the kind of hands that should have been struggling to reach a simple chord. But as they hovered over the keys, there was a sense of purpose, authority that was completely at odds with their size. His fingers descended, and the sound that came out was not a crash. It was not a bang. It was a single, clear note, hanging in the air like a drop of perfect, pure water. Then another and another. The notes were not random. They were connected, forming a melody that was both familiar and strangely new. The man's polite, dismissive mask dissolved. His arms uncrossed and fell to his sides. He leaned forward, his body moving of its own accord, drawn by the sound. It wasn't a nursery rhyme. It wasn't a simple folk tune. The melody was complex, weaving in and out of itself in a way that spoke of a deep understanding of music theory. But more than that, it was the touch. The boy's fingers were not striking the keys. They were caressing them. Each note was shaped with a delicacy that was breathtaking. Some were soft, like whispers, while others swelled with a gentle, aching sadness. The man, whose own hands were instruments of flawless precision, was stunned. He had spent a lifetime perfecting his touch, learning how to coax 1,000 different emotions from the very same keys. And here was a child, a boy who couldn't even reach the pedals, doing it with an innate, God-given grace. The melody began to take shape, and the man finally recognized it. It was Clair de Lune by Debussy, a piece he knew intimately, a piece he had played hundreds of times. But he had never heard it played like this. His own renditions were technically perfect, every note in its place, every dynamic marked and executed with the accuracy of a machine. But this was different. The boy wasn't just playing the notes on the page. He was telling the story behind them. He was painting a picture with sound. The man could almost see the moonlight the music was named for, a soft silver light spilling across a dark, still lake. He could feel the quiet melancholy, the gentle longing, the profound peace of a solitary night. He watched the boy's hands. They moved with a confidence that was baffling. They navigated the tricky passages, the stretches and leaps that challenged even the most seasoned professionals with an ease that seemed impossible. The boy's left hand laid down a foundation of soft, rolling chords, while his right hand danced above, playing the haunting, beautiful melody. His body swayed slightly, his whole being absorbed in the music. His eyes were closed, his face a mask of pure concentration. He wasn't thinking about what he was doing. He was feeling it. He was inside the music, and he was inviting everyone in the lobby to come in with him. The man forgot he was tired. He forgot he was a famous pianist. He forgot the tour, the hotels, the empty applause. All of it melted away, replaced by the overwhelming beauty of the sound filling the grand lobby. The noise of the world had faded completely. The clatter of dishes, the hum of conversations, the ding of the elevator, it was all gone. There was only the music. He looked around and saw that he wasn't the only one who had been captivated. A small group of people had gathered, standing at a respectful distance. A businessman with his phone to his ear had slowly lowered it, his mouth slightly agape. A pair of women who had been chatting animatedly were now silent, their eyes fixed on the small figure at the piano. Even the hotel staff, the ones who moved through the lobby like ghosts, had stopped to listen. The boy's mother stood a few feet away, her hand covering her mouth. Her eyes were wide, a mixture of shock, pride, and a touch of disbelief, as if she couldn't quite believe what was coming from her own child. She looked from her son to the man at the piano, her expression apologetic, as if she were sorry for this incredible, unexpected intrusion. But the man felt no apology. He felt only gratitude. This boy, this small, unassuming child, was doing something for him that no doctor, no vacation, no amount of rest could do. He was reminding him why he fell in love with the piano in the first place. He was showing him the magic he had lost. The boy's playing was not about perfection. It was about passion. It was raw and pure and unfiltered. It was the sound of a soul speaking directly to another. Without the interference of ego or expectation, the music swelled, moving into a more complex, emotional section. The boy's fingers moved faster, the melody becoming more urgent, more pleading. The man could feel his own heart beating in time with the music. He felt a lump form in his throat, a sting of tears behind his eyes. He hadn't cried in years, not from sadness, not from joy. But now, sitting here, listening to this child play, he felt a wave of emotion so powerful it almost broke him. It was the feeling of coming home after a long, long journey. It was the feeling of finding something you thought was lost forever. The piece began to slow down, the melody returning to the soft, gentle theme from the beginning. The boy's touch became even lighter, his fingers barely touching the keys, as if he were afraid of breaking the spell. The final notes hung in the air, each one a soft, shimmering echo of the one before it, until they faded into a silence that was more profound, more beautiful than any sound the man had ever heard. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The entire lobby was held captive by the magic the boy had created. The silence was a shared, sacred space. Then, someone started to clap. It was a single, hesitant sound at first, then another and another, until a wave of warm, genuine applause filled the room. It was not the polite, obligatory applause he was used to. It was real. It was the sound of people who had been truly moved. The boy opened his eyes. The intense look of concentration on his face vanished, replaced by the shy, slightly awkward expression of a child who suddenly realizes everyone is looking at him. He slid off the bench, his sneakers squeaking on the marble floor once again, and hurried back to his mother's side, burying his face in her skirt. The man sat there, staring at the empty piano bench, his world completely and utterly changed. He was no longer a tired, cynical musician. He was a believer again. And he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his very core, that this was not the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The applause started softly, a single person clapping, then another, like the first few drops of a rainstorm before the sky opens up. It was hesitant at first, as if the people in the lobby were afraid to break the spell the boy had woven. But then the sound grew. A warm, genuine wave of appreciation that washed over the grand, silent space. It wasn't the polite, reserved clapping the pianist was used to hearing in concert halls. This was different. This was the sound of pure, unfiltered emotion. It's the sound of people who had just witnessed something they couldn't explain. The man at the piano remained frozen, his hands still resting on his knees. His mind was a whirlwind, trying to process what he had just heard. He, a master of the instrument, a man who had dedicated his entire life to understanding the language of music, was utterly speechless. He analyzed the performance in his head, breaking it down note by note. The touch, the phrasing, the dynamic sit was all there. But it was the feeling behind it that had shattered him. It was a feeling he hadn't been able to find in his own playing for years. He had been so focused on the technical perfection, on hitting every note with flawless precision, that he had forgotten the most important part, the soul. This little boy, who probably didn't know the first thing about music theory, had played with more soul in 3 minutes than the pianist had mustered in 3 years. He watched as the boy, his face now hidden against his mother's leg, seemed to shrink. The bold, confident performer who had commanded the piano had vanished, replaced by a shy child who was overwhelmed by the attention. The mother, her eyes still wide with a mixture of pride and disbelief, stroked her son's hair gently. She looked over at the pianist, her expression a silent apology, as if she were sorry for the magnificent interruption her son had caused. The pianist knew he had to move. He couldn't just sit there like a statue. He felt a pull, a deep, undeniable need to connect with this small, miraculous child and his mother. He pushed himself up from the bench, his legs feeling strangely unsteady, as if the ground beneath him had shifted. He walked towards them, not with the confident stride of a world-famous artist, but with the hesitant steps of a pilgrim approaching a sacred site. The small crowd parted for him, their faces turned towards him with looks of shared wonder. As he got closer, the mother's nervousness became more apparent. She straightened up, clutching her son's shoulder protectively. "I'm so sorry," she began, her voice barely a whisper. He loves pianos. I hope he wasn't a bother." The pianist shook his head, a slow, deliberate motion. He couldn't find his voice at first. He just looked at the small boy who was peeking out at him from behind his mother's coat. Finally, he managed to speak, his voice sounding rough and unfamiliar to his own ears. "A bother?" he said, a faint, incredulous smile touching his lips. No, that was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard." The mother's eyes softened, her relief palpable. The pianist did something he hadn't done in a long, long time. He knelt down on the cold marble floor, bringing himself to the boy's level. It was a gesture of humility, a way of showing that in this moment the child was the master and he was the student. The boy looked at him, his shyness slowly giving way to curiosity. "How did you do that?" the pianist asked, his voice gentle. "How did you learn to play like that?" The boy shrugged, a small, simple gesture. "I don't know," he said, his voice soft but clear. "I just hear it in my head, and then my fingers know what to do." The pianist felt a chill run down his spine. It was the answer he both expected and dreaded. It wasn't about practice or lessons. It wasn't about discipline or study. It was a gift. It was as natural to this boy as breathing. He thought about his own journey, the thousands of hours of grueling practice, the endless repetition, the frustration, and the sacrifice. He had earned his skill note by painful note. But this boy had been born with it. He was a conduit for the music, pure and perfect channel. The pianist looked into the boy's eyes. For the first time, he saw a spark of the old fire he thought had died in himself. It was a spark of curiosity, of excitement, of the sheer, unadulterated love for music. He felt a question form on his lips, a question that came from a place deep inside him, a place he thought had long been buried. "Is that the only one you know?" he asked, his voice filled with a childlike hope. The boy shook his head. "No," he said. "I know lots of them." "Which ones?" The pianist pressed, his heart beating a little faster. The boy seemed to think for a moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Well," he said slowly, "that one was quiet. It was like the moon, but I know a loud one. It's like a storm." Storm. The word hung in the air between them. The pianist's mind raced, trying to guess what a loud one could be in the mind of a 7-year-old. He had to know. He had to hear it. He looked up at the mother, his eyes pleading. "Would you mind?" asked. "Just for one more moment?" The mother hesitated, looking down at her son. The boy, however, was already looking back at the piano, his eyes shining with that same intense focus from before. The shyness was gone again, replaced by the quiet determination of a musician about to perform. He gave a small, determined nod and, without waiting for his mother's permission, he walked back to the bench. He climbed up again, his movements more confident this time. He settled himself, his feet dangling, his hands resting in his lap. The pianist remained kneeling on the floor, not wanting to miss a single second of what was about to happen. The lobby grew quiet again, the crowd leaning in, sensing that something even more extraordinary was about to unfold. The boy took his deep breath, and then his hands were on the keys. But this time, the sound that erupted was not a gentle, moonlit melody. It was a torrent. A cascade of notes, a whirlwind of sound that filled the lobby with a raw, untamed energy. It was a Chopin etude, one of the most difficult pieces ever written for the piano. A piece that required not just technical skill, but incredible power and stamina. The transformation was staggering. The delicate touch from before was replaced by a ferocious, commanding strength. The boy's fingers flew across the keyboard, a blur of motion, striking the keys with a force that seemed impossible for his small frame. The music was a storm, just as he had promised. It was a tempest of passion and fury, of lightning-fast runs and thunderous chords. His body swayed with the music, his small frame rocking with the power of the sound he was creating. He was no longer just playing the piano. He was battling it, taming it, unleashing its full, untamed voice. The pianist watched, his mouth agape, his heart pounding in his chest. He was no longer just an observer. He was a student learning a lesson he never knew he needed. He saw things in the boy's technique that he had only read about in books. Things he had tried to master himself but had never been able to execute with such raw, natural perfection. The boy's left hand leaped across vast distances, landing on powerful octaves with unerring accuracy. His right hand navigated intricate, complex passages with a speed and dexterity that was breathtaking. But it was more than just the technical brilliance. It was the emotion. The music was not just loud, it was alive. It was filled with a drama, a narrative, a story of struggle and triumph. The pianist felt as if he were being swept away by a flood of pure, unfiltered emotion. He had never heard anything like it. He had played this piece himself, in concert halls all over the world. But his own performances felt like pale, lifeless imitations compared to this. This was the real thing. This was the music as it was meant to be played, the fire and a passion that came straight from the soul. The crowd was utterly mesmerized. No one moved. No one spoke. They were all caught in the eye of the boy's musical storm, their faces reflecting a mixture of awe, disbelief, and sheer, unadulterated joy. The pianist looked around and saw the same look on every face. They were all witnessing something impossible, something magical. They were all sharing a moment that none of them would ever forget. The music built to a breathtaking climax, a final thunderous cascade of notes that shook the very foundations of the lobby. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The final chord hung in the air, a powerful, resonant sound that slowly faded into a silence that was even more profound than the one before. The silence was not empty. It was filled with the echo of the storm, the lingering presence of the magic that had just occurred. The boy sat there for a moment, his chest heaving, his small body spent from the effort. Then he slowly lowered his hands, his job done. The pianist remained on his knees, humbled and completely, utterly changed. The silence that followed the final chord was a living thing. It was not the quiet of an empty room, but a heavy, charged stillness that held the echo of the storm. The last note seemed to vibrate in the very air, a powerful resonance that sank into the marble floors and the high ceiling. Wrapping itself around every person in the lobby, no one moved. No one dared to breathe. It was as if they were all afraid that any sound, any slight movement, would shatter the fragile, magical moment that had just passed. The man on the floor, the world-famous pianist, felt that silence more than anyone. It was the silence of a world being reborn. Then, a sound broke the spell. It wasn't a clap. It was a shaky, indrawn breath from a woman standing near the front, followed by a single, tearful sob. That sound was a key turning in a lock, and suddenly the lobby was filled with noise. But it was not the normal noise of a busy hotel. It was a wave of sound born from pure, unadulterated awe. The applause started, not as a polite patter, but as a roar. It was a thunderous, overwhelming expression of gratitude and wonder. People were not just clapping. They were cheering, some were crying, others were shaking their heads in disbelief, as if trying to convince themselves that what they had just witnessed was real. The boy, however, seemed immune to the eruption around him. The moment the last note faded, the little maestro vanished, replaced by a tired little boy. His shoulders, which had been squared with the power of the music, now slumped. He rubbed his eyes with the back of his small hand, a gesture of pure, simple childhood. He slid off the massive bench, his legs seeming a little wobbly this time, and without a word. He walked back to his mother and buried his face in her coat. The storm had passed, and he was just a child seeking shelter. The pianist slowly pushed himself up from the floor. His joints ached from kneeling for so long on the hard marble, but it was a good ache. A feeling that grounded him in a reality that suddenly seemed more vibrant and more real than it had just minutes before. The weariness that had been his constant companion for years was gone. It had been burned away by the fire of the boy's music. He felt a lightness in his step, a clarity in his mind that he hadn't experienced in a decade. He had a purpose now. A mission that was more important than any concert, any review, any standing ovation. He walked towards the mother and son, his path cleared by the crowd who still looked at him with expressions of shared reverence. The mother looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of emotions, pride, confusion, and a deep protective love. She held her son close, as if afraid this famous man might somehow take him away. "Excuse me," the pianist said, his voice sounding rough and unfamiliar to his own ears. It wasn't the polished, controlled voice of a celebrity giving an interview. It was the voice of a man who had been shaken to his very core. I have to ask, how long has he been playing?" The mother looked down at the top of her son's head, stroking his hair gently. "He's not really playing in the way you mean," she said, her voice soft and a little hesitant. "He's never had a lesson. We can't afford things like that." The pianist felt a jolt, a shock that went through him like an electric current. No lessons. It was impossible. What he had just heard was not just talent. It was a level of mastery that took a lifetime of disciplined study to achieve. But how? He stammered, struggling to form the question. The Chopin, the Debussy. How does he know them? The mother gave a small, sad smile. "We have an old tablet, a hand-me-down. He watches videos on it. That's all. He finds them himself. Concerts, tutorials, anything with a piano. He just watches, and then he comes to places like this, to hotels or department stores, and asks if he can play. He loves it. It's the only thing he's ever wanted." The pianist felt his heart break a little, not with sadness, but with an overwhelming sense of wonder and injustice. This incredible gift, this once-in-a-generation talent, was being nurtured on scraps, on fuzzy videos on a second-hand device, on brief stolen moments at public pianos. He thought of his own journey, the endless money spent on the best teachers, the finest instruments, the most prestigious schools. He had been given every advantage, and yet this boy with nothing had achieved a level of artistry he could only dream of. He looked at the boy, was now peeking out at him from behind his mother's coat. The shyness was back, but in his eyes, the pianist could still see the embers of the fire that had raged on the piano. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep into his soul, that he could not let this moment be the end of the story. He could not let this boy walk out of this lobby and disappear back into a world where his gift would likely wither and die. He knelt down again, one last time, so he could look the boy directly in the eye. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice now gentle but firm, filled with a new authority. The boy whispered his name, so softly that the pianist had to lean in to hear it. All the pianist said, a genuine warm smile spreading across his face for the first time in years. "It is a great honor to meet you." He then stood up and turned to the mother, his expression serious. "This gift," he said, his voice low and intense. "It is a rare and precious thing. It is not something that can be taught, but it is something that must be nurtured. It would be a crime against music itself to let it remain hidden." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, elegant card case. He took out a card, one of the simple, unadorned ones, with just his name and a phone number. He held it out to the mother. "Take this," he said. "This is the number for my personal manager. Call him tomorrow. Tell him I told you to call. Tell him the boy's name. Don't take no for an answer." The mother stared at the card, then at him, her hand trembling as she reached out to take it. I don't understand," she stammered. "I am going to teach him," the pianist said, the words feeling like a sacred vow. "Not because he needs me, but because I need him. And we will find him the best instrument. We will do whatever it takes. His journey starts now. Do you understand?" Tears welled up in the mother's eyes, but this time they were tears of pure, unbridled joy. She could only nod, clutching the card in her hand as if it were a winning lottery ticket. The pianist gave the boy one last reassuring nod, a silent promise between them. He watched as they walked away, the small boy holding his mother's hand, turning back once to give a final shy wave before they disappeared through the revolving doors into the bright afternoon sun. The lobby was slowly returning to normal, the crowd dispersing, the spell finally broken. But the pianist knew that nothing would ever be normal again. He walked back to the piano and sat down on the bench. He looked at the keys, but he didn't play. He just rested his hands on them, feeling the cool, smooth ivory beneath his fingers. The instrument was no longer a stranger. It was no longer a burden. It was a friend, a confidant, a world of limitless possibility. The music hadn't left him. He had just forgotten how to listen. He had been so focused on speaking the language of music perfectly that he had forgotten how to hear its soul, and a little boy, with a storm in his fingers and the moonlight in his touch, had just reminded him. The silence in the lobby was no longer heavy or empty. It was peaceful. It was full of promise. And for the first time in a very long time, the pianist felt truly, completely, and wonderfully alive.